Good morning and welcome. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. We're a nonpartisan think tank and we do research on international affairs and national security. And this morning, we're having our annual conference we do every year with the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. We're going to be talking about emerging issues in the Indo-Pacific. I think all eyes have been riveted for the last few months on Eurasia, but there are implications for the Indo-Pacific as well as other emerging issues that I think are highly worthy of discussion. We're going to do that this morning. Here to moderate for us is the director of our Asia program, Jacques Delisle. He's also the director of our new China Center, which we've just recently stood up. He's a Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. We also have here moderating for us today Shihoko Goto, who is the Director of Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Shihoko was a financial journalist covering international political economy with focus on Asian markets. She did that for Dow Jones News Service and the United Press. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderators this morning, Jacques Delisle and Shihoko Goto. But before I do that, I also want to thank our board members, our sponsors, our members, and our donors for their generous support. We could not do this without you. I'd also like to give a special thanks to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. for helping us with this program. And we do this, as I mentioned, annually, and we're deeply grateful to them for that. Thank you very much. And I will turn it over to our moderators.
Great. So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. It's always really wonderful to be able to join forces with FPRI. We're covering a very big, ambitious topic today, and I'm excited to be able to represent the Wilson Center for a discussion on economic security and geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific. The first panel will be focusing on economic security and the geopolitics and much more of taking a bird's eye view of the challenges ahead. And the second panel, which will be moderated by Jacques Delisle, will focus on a specific topic, namely the semiconductor industry. I would argue that addressing concerns about economic security is one of the biggest challenges facing the regional order in Asia today. Not just for the regional order, but also for the individual countries that make up the Indo-Pacific and for their own domestic growth and concerns about resilience of their own growth trajectories. Economic security concerns has also become shorthand for dealing with economic competition with China. It is an issue that unites the United States with its trusted partners and allies. There is a shared threat perception that China poses a formidable challenge to the established rules, values that have led to growth worldwide since the end of World War II. And there are shared concerns too about balancing the need to deal with the China challenge as a threat, but also as a partner, especially on the trading front. COVID disruptions have obviously highlighted the fragility of global connectivity. We're now at a stage where we're reconsidering economic networks and partnerships, and we're reassessing the value of efficiency over the resilience of supply chains. But what I hope we can do in our first hour is to look at it from the perspective of various governments. And one would certainly be from the perspective of Beijing. How does China see this challenge to its own economic security? And what is its longer-term strategy to ensure that its remarkable growth and surging military capabilities continue to expand in order to meet its own economic and security concerns moving forward? So again, it's a large, ambitious topic, but I'm excited to be able to introduce a great lineup of speakers who are more than capable to meet the challenge at hand. I'd like to introduce them very briefly in the order that I've invited them to speak. First up is Xiaomeng Lu, who is Director for Geo-Technology at the Eurasia Group, and she focuses on the interactions of emerging technologies with geopolitics, market dynamics, and regulatory norms. Some key policy issues she covers is data governance and privacy, big tech antitrust, artificial intelligence, and digital trade. So obviously, she's very, very busy. Before joining the Eurasia Group, she was the China practice lead at a consulting firm, Access Partnership, and she has also worked as a global policy director at the Information Technology Industry Council. Next will be James Schoff. He is Senior Director of the US-Japan Next Alliance Initiative at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA, where amongst other goals, he analyzes new alliance connections from across foreign security and technology policy areas. Previously, Jim was a senior fellow and director of the Japan program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he has also served as senior advisor for East Asia policy at the US Office of the Secretary of Defense. And finally, we will turn to Cordell Hall, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. He's also a principal at WestExec Advisors. He is a former acting undersecretary for industry and security at the Commerce Department, where he led the Bureau of Industry and Security, a federal law enforcement organization responsible for criminal and administrative enforcement of US export control laws. And he managed the department's National Security Division, responsible for export controls of dual-use technologies, foreign investment reviews through CFIUS, and treaty compliance. So with that, let me turn it to you, Xiaomeng.
Thank you for the great introduction. I think today I will focus my remarks around China's Digital Silk Road initiative and its impact in the Southeast Asia region. The key driver behind the Digital Silk Road, the DSR effort, is China's desire to expand influence and reputation as a global technological powerhouse and an enhancer of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. The DSR encourages companies to participate in digital infrastructure project and technology supply chains and allow these firms to benefit from policy and loan support from Beijing. But government support to DSR is not as even or direct as it is for the BRI. I think that's an important differentiation here compared to the well-documented close government-private sector coordination under BRI. A large number of DSR participants are private sector companies whose efforts are primarily driven by commercial interests. And certain aspects of the government-private sector relationship in DSR is somewhat even analogous to the traditional public-private sector partnership in the US. And in many ways, the government has leveraged the DSR as a branding exercise to support its own political narrative. Having said that, I think in the long run, this confluence of factors will transform the ad hoc and largely bottom-up investments and expansion in the region into more structured influence, and DSR companies will play greater roles in national regulations and policy in this part of the world going forward. And at Eurasia Group, we did an assessment of DSR's impact in Southeast Asia across the technology ecosystem. We evaluated the competitive landscape in about 5-6 market segments. This including mobile system, digital services and data centers, and cloud market, undersea cables, as well as 5G infrastructure and human capital self-influencing project. And I think today I will probably mention 3 of them as examples to show our conclusion from these studies. In the mobile market, for example, Chinese brands are a dominant force, and their products are very adaptive and perhaps more importantly, very cost effective. And that's what the local consumers like. Localized advertisement and sales tactics prove to be a very powerful strategy. But all these successful Chinese mobile phone brands depend on Android and Play Store, their Western peers, to operate. There are attempts to create alternatives, things like Huawei's HMS operating system or the Smartphone Alliance that try to create their own operating system, the initiative that called GDSA, but both of them remain at a very nascent stage and bear limited geopolitical implications in the near to medium term. That's the mobile market. And in terms of e-payment and e-commerce industry, Alibaba and Tencent have expanded their fintech, commerce, and online entertainment empires through aggressive acquisition. Their platforms are offering increasingly integrated solutions across the region. And this type of value chain consolidation can lead to migration of workloads onto Chinese cloud service providers' data centers, and also adoption of the platform's technologies between Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, and a few state-owned Chinese telecom companies. They have established a large number of data centers in Southeast Asia. That's over time, I think this type of effort will make the Chinese tech stack a somewhat de facto choice for the local consumers and enterprises. And in addition to that, I think for digital infrastructure, 5G is probably the most controversial aspect of the DSR. On the ground of Southeast Asia, economies have generally welcomed Chinese investments to expand capacity and coverage in underserved areas. The benefits of Chinese investments in networks that enable digital economy appear to outweigh fears of surveillance or cybersecurity. But in the region, Australia and Japan's restriction have placed restriction on Huawei and ZTE, and this type of government moves have further invigorated China's desire to secure its company's participation in global 5G rollout. Now, I think the challenge is that US move to cut off Huawei's access to cutting-edge semiconductor have raised significant question about whether the company can remain globally competitive. But given the region's importance to the company, Huawei could prioritize its limited stockpile of 5G semiconductors inventory outside of China for this particular market, since the firm and its Chinese peers have built long-term relationships and established major footholds in the market already. And what does all this mean for Western competitors to DSR companies? I think maybe I will bring up 2 instances. Number one, I think in the mobile and digital service market, Southeast Asia is very fragmented and fiercely competitive. For instance, the region's super apps, Grab and Gojek, both have attract and retain users through demand for their unprofitable ride-hailing services, but their smaller e-wallet and food delivery segments are understood to be the real profit makers. There's not much brand loyalty to either service, and either company currently has a business model that's likely to remain sustainable in the long run. And Chinese money has established and continue to sustain the leading super apps in this cutthroat market. It's not entirely clear whether US companies are looking to challenge the super apps, but successful competition will probably require playing into their strengths while being prepared to localize products and compete in price wars. But on the hardware infrastructure side, I think the battle has already begun. In Malaysia, for example, Chinese firms are the first foreign cloud service providers to set up data centers. In 2020, Alibaba announced its plan to invest 28 billion in data centers by 2022. However, last year, Malaysia offered approvals to Western firms like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon to construct hyperscale data centers. It's a tricky situation, and the Malaysia government appears to deliberately leave it vague about what the new approvals means, suggesting maybe there's an effort to diversify investments, but at the same time avoid drawing Beijing's ire to the absence of Chinese players in this batch of approval. And this ambiguity could leave the government space for issuing other permissions to GSR companies, nonetheless showing the authorities in Malaysia maybe hedging their bets between the two competing groups. Maybe I will just stop myself there and leave the rest of the topics for further discussion.
Thank you. You've covered a lot of ground, and I really want to follow up on the Malaysia conundrum as well. But let me now turn to Jim. And as he's setting up his slides, let me just inform the audience that we are taking questions live. You can put your questions in the chat, not the chat box, the Q&A box. So if during the course of this conversation, if you have any questions, please put them in there. All right, so Jim, over to you.
Great, well, thank you so much, Shihoko. It's really great to be with you all. And that was an excellent opening. So I'm here at the Next Alliance Initiative at Sasakawa, USA, and we're focused on new and emerging challenges for the Alliance. And this year, we're particularly focused on economic security. And the question is why? And you've already alluded to some of it, Shihoko. But it's in part because there's, it's partly the diplomatic and economic implications and issues that Xiaomeng so well described just now. But it's also, I think, about raw power and balance of power in the region. And that's part of what's motivating countries and the allies on this front, because we see a combination of the renewal of great power rivalry between the United States and China, coinciding with the fourth industrial revolution, where advances in artificial intelligence, data mining, data extraction, and the manipulation of data, together with progress or eventual progress in quantum computing, high performance computing, all of which has people worried that whoever really dominates or leads early on in this field will have an unassailable position in regional economic and military competition. So that's prompting the fear of losing this race is prompting a huge investment by companies and countries. And so the allies are trying to build as big of an innovation ecosystem as possible, including data sharing. And we also need to be confident in the protections in order to share this data and technology. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my notes here. We need confidence in sharing this data, and we need to align strategies and funding for efficiency and effectiveness. So the US and Japan have a long history of science and technology cooperation, starting in the mid-1960s, with work on natural resources, medical sciences, and expanding to nearly every field you can imagine. The political and foreign policy backdrop or context for this collaboration has evolved, ebbing and flowing in terms of perceived priority and opportunity and direct competition between the two countries. But I think it's fair to say now that we've never seen the kind of bilateral alignment that exists today in terms of policymaker interest, a widely perceived need for foreign collaboration in science and technology, specific areas of research focus, and the overall goals of that collaboration. And I'd pick three main goals. One, mitigating climate change or its impact. Number two, being able to control pandemics. And third, staying ahead of China in a wide range of critical technologies and scientific discovery. And it's this last objective that is arguably the most important in a bilateral context, because more open multilateral engagement is available for the first two. And it has a potentially big impact on the way the US and Japan conduct science cooperation within the alliance. So I think the case for US-Japan science and technology cooperation is pretty clear. Japan is the third largest investor in research and development behind the United States and China. Japanese companies fund more R&D in the United States than any other country's firms. Japan is also the third most prolific patent filer in the world behind China and the United States. So pooling resources, data, and talent would benefit both allies. The question is not whether bilateral science and technology cooperation is a shared strategic opportunity, but rather how to adapt to keep up with new geopolitical realities. So the purpose of the slide here is to show you what Japan has been doing to try to harmonize some of its policies and approaches with the United States and with European partners to build as big of an ecosystem for innovation as possible. So this week, or probably next week, Japan will probably pass some new legislation. It's already passed the lower house. It's just got to pass the upper house now on what they call their economic security legislation. But what does it do for the alliance and how do we capitalize on it? Before I get to the legislation itself, the top part of this slide shows how Japan has been changing a lot of policies to align more closely with the US and Europe. Everything from monitoring real estate transactions in case Chinese companies or Chinese intelligence buys land next to sensitive areas of innovation in Japan, to strengthening what they call research integrity or more transparency in terms of engineer and scientist connections to Chinese funded programs and projects in other parts of Asia. Investment screening, looking at how Chinese venture capital, what companies they're investing in, and actually prohibiting certain investments in certain industry areas in Japan by China. Clarifying deemed exports or the hiring of non-Japanese engineers and scientists in the private sector, and trying to be more active with the United States and others in international standard setting and rulemaking organizations. Now, the legislation itself, or the number two on this slide, the blue boxes toward the bottom, the two most relevant parts for the US-Japan alliance are the supply chain portion, the focus on supply chains, and what they call technology cooperation with the private sector. So for the supply chain piece, the law is focused primarily on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, minerals, and high capacity batteries. So there will be public support for companies that contribute to stable supply in these areas. There will be a variety of requirements and kind of reporting requirements and by the companies to have a plan to provide for stable supply and looking through their own supply chains to assure themselves of stable supply. And this is an alliance opportunity, I think, is in the partnering to meet those national requirements. It doesn't have to be each country's companies assuring the complete stable supply on their own. This is, again, the US and Japan and Europe and others are looking at this as potentially a collective opportunity, but it can only be done if they're approaching the supply chain problem and their certification of satisfying the various rules set out in a harmonized way or in a similar way. On the technology cooperation side, there's a focus on space engineering, marine engineering, quantum technology, AI, and biotechnology. There are funds designated to promote research and development in these key areas that will be disseminated by the Cabinet Office with support from an expert advisory committee, which will have private sector and university scientists and others as part of that, in cooperation with the Japan Science and Technology Agency and NEDO, or the New Energy Development Organization, which is part of the Economy, Trade, and Industry Ministry. And they'll have a designated think tank that they're creating to support this. So here is another opportunity, I think, for the Alliance. My main suggestions, or what we've been kind of talking about recently within the Alliance, is how to bring together the private sector in both countries to connect the commercial technology and the supply chain plans and programs to align with national strategy. Both the United States and Japan are, try to create a hands-off or an arm's length distance between government and the private sector on this front, but the government itself does not sufficiently understand either the technology or the true supply chain details. So it needs to partner with industry, and it is hopefully trying to foster a collaboration between the private sector in the United States and Japan on this front. Also, I think the US and Japan have an opportunity to better leverage the Department of Energy National Lab system here in the United States, together with some of the institutes and universities in Japan. There's a key challenge here because the US tends to approach a lot of these investments in some of these critical emerging technologies from a dual use perspective. So there's the commercial use, but also the military use factor is very important. And the Defense Department in the US has a large budget to support this. In Japan, the scientific community and the engineering community and the private sector, the commercial private sector is more skittish or nervous or politically sensitive around the issue of military use for a variety of legal and historical reasons. So it's often very difficult to collaborate in certain areas that may have an explicit military application. So that's one area that the US and Japan are having some difficulty with. There's a joint committee on science and technology cooperation within the Alliance. This is from a 1988 agreement that we had that has generally been a very bottom-up system of soliciting ideas from the scientific community in each country. But we'll see whether or not there's an opportunity, I think, to have a little bit more of a top-down collaborative strategic approach to investment. And this can be in purely unclassified, non-military research, but for the benefit of both countries and more widely. And I think there will also need to be a follow-on economic security legislation in Japan, because they were not able, for political reasons, to include the extension of security clearances to private companies not working on pure defense projects. So sharing information on cyber attacks in the commercial sphere, other types of proprietary research where the US has companies have security clearances to do that kind of thing. In Japan right now, they still do not. So there's a bit of a gap on that front. And export controls too. The authorities for certain export controls in Japan are not as broadly empowered from a national security perspective. So that's been a challenge in aligning sometimes when we decide that there are certain controls we want to put on the export of certain technology products. But it's a very active area of Alliance communication. They're making progress, but there's still more to do on this front. And I think I'll stop there and let us move on to the next side of the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, Jim, thank you so much. You provided a lot of material for us to kind of digest there, and I have so many questions to ask. But let me turn to Cordell, who's been incredibly patient. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Shihoko, and thanks to FPRI and the Wilson Center for the invitation to be here with you today. My co-panelists have done a really great job laying a lot down, and I've been asked to talk about the idea of separate technology spheres and sort of economic competition more generally. I'm going to try and give sort of I think Shihoko said a bird's eye view. I'll probably try and go maybe a 10,000 foot level because I really do want to leave a lot of time for the discussion. But we've already begun seeing, increasingly seeing separate technology spheres between particularly the US and China. And we've seen it in a number of platforms and technology services. And you know, think Twitter versus Weibo, think of LinkedIn and its fairly recent announcement of exiting the mainland China market. You know, we've seen it in another number of payment systems. For instance, it's you know, difficult to use Apple Pay in mainland China. You use it through the web browser versus your phone. But the separation of the spheres also gets to hardware and to the inputs for technology as well. And during my time in government, we spent a lot of time. You know, Xiaomeng brought up the export controls on Huawei and semiconductors more broadly, and that was an item for which I had a front row seat. And it, you know, we put pretty significant export controls on semiconductor and semiconductor manufacturing equipment going to Huawei, but to China more broadly, and to China's homegrown semiconductor manufacturing company, SMIC. You know, counter export controls have been announced and are in process of being implemented in China. We'll see what that ends up looking like, but certainly the Chinese government has not been quiet about it. They've sanctioned a number of former U.S. officials, I think, and some current ones as well. But you know, the U.S. government view on China really, or at least on the technology piece of this, really, you know, the U.S. views China as exporting widespread techno-authoritarianism, and that is an issue of bipartisan concern here in the U.S. We've seen a number of places, namely through the Middle East and through Africa, where Chinese government and part of the digital Silk Road that Xiaomeng so ably spoke about. We're seeing the building of smart cities. We're seeing you know, export of surveillance equipment and that sort of thing, which has been of great concern to the U.S. A number of countries around the world, certainly China among them, have embraced the notion of digital sovereignty. And that, in a lot of ways, is putting strain on things like Facebook and Google, and either restricting or not permitting them to be used in country under the idea of countering purported misinformation and disinformation. And so, at least from the U.S. government perspective, you know, that idea is largely unaligned with our values, and I'll get to the U.S. side of the coin in just a moment. But it does make it's an issue really of bipartisan concern, and we're seeing that a little bit less on you know, the internet side of things, but certainly the U.S. Congress right now is debating a broad technology bill that essentially is the U.S. government's response to all of these items over the last couple of years vis-a-vis the Chinese government. But I promise I'd get to the U.S. side, and that's certainly true. And the U.S. government has taken the long has taken the view that China's export of techno-authoritarianism is contrary to our values. Now, of course, the largely criticism in this country is there's too little. Some people say there's too little regulation of the internet, and one need look no further than Elon Musk's announced purchase of Twitter, and it's sparked a reaction that has really been much bigger than I frankly imagined it would be. But that is something that you know, the U.S. side, and there are a number of bills seeking to crack down on U.S. tech companies on antitrust grounds. There have been a number of former national security folks who have written against that. So this really is a challenge here on our home shores as well. But on both sides of the Pacific, it really gets to data control, data localization, and control over the messaging. Certainly on the China side, we've seen the reports of the censorship of communications about the COVID lockdown in Shanghai and in other places, the prohibition in mainland China and elsewhere on virtual private networks. But the U.S. side is also concerned about data localization issues. And one publicly reported example, the purchase of TikTok, at least according to public reports, one of the conditions for the Committee on Foreign Investments in the U.S. permitting that transaction to finally finish after many, many years of review has been a data localization requirement and keeping U.S. person information ring-fenced from TikTok's Chinese employees. That is, at least again, according to public reports, of key interest to U.S. policymakers. And that's certainly not limited to the TikTok example. Data localization, again, on both sides of the coin have been frontline for many, and China certainly has a number of recently enacted laws, the Personal Information Protection Law and the Data Protection Law, that really gives the government a much stronger hand in ensuring the security and the ability to move Chinese person information. So again, both sides are spending a lot of time and a lot of effort to try and maintain the security of the information for lots and lots of reasons that we can discuss during the Q&A. But let me just get very quickly to where I see this going. I think, bottom line, I think the trend lines are worsening. I don't see a chance for mending of the fences anytime soon. I think the political dynamics on both sides of the Pacific make it nearly impossible that will happen in the short or medium term. In the short term, the 20th Party Congress coming this fall certainly is unhelpful on the Chinese side. And we, of course, have our own elections coming up. And an example of that is seeing the China bill that's had several names over the last couple of months, but the USCICA is the shorthand here. If that had been negotiated 6 months ago, I think Congress would have been a lot farther along with it than it is now. But the fact that we're now May into a midterm election year really makes it hard, and I think that's hard on a number of things. U.S.-China competition really is one area where I've seen strong bipartisan cooperation here in the U.S. side, and so I don't see that changing again in the near term. Also, the Chinese government also has embraced a concept called dual circulation, and whereby that is trying to seek to wean China off of Western technologies, and in large part because of export controls and sanctions and other items, really seeking to insulate its technological sphere from U.S. and other Western companies' influence, but at the same time also seeking to get other countries more intertwined with the Chinese system, and that's done through a number of ways, including participation on standards bodies and the Digital Silk Road, among others. So anyway, I'll wrap it up here. I'm hopeful, but not terribly optimistic that these trend lines will go. I think the U.S.-China economic competition is going to be something that is the challenge, the geopolitical challenge for this generation. I certainly hope it can be managed. I hope it doesn't lead us into places where neither country really wants to go, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Cordell, thank you very much for the sobering thoughts. Let me kind of expand it, take it from there. You mentioned a lot of key phrases there, but one of the things that I really want to focus a little bit on is the dual circulation strategy that China is really trying to move forward with. Of course, this came before COVID. I think with post-COVID, or as we deal with the pandemic and its aftermath, that kind of approach is actually not only is China hunkering down on the dual circulation strategy in terms of enhancing its own domestic capabilities on the one hand, and reaching out to emerging markets in particular to have a consortium of countries more greatly dependent on its technology architecture. So the question becomes, is this emergence of technology spheres inevitable? And if so, what kind of spheres will they be? I think from what I hear from you, Cordell, you're saying it was very much in the Cold War model, where it's US versus China. I'm wondering if, Jim, if you share that, or if it's going to be a more multipolar area. And then for you, Xiaomeng, perhaps, if there are these emergence of technology spheres, is there possibility for overlap in key regions such as Southeast Asia, where it becomes more like a dual spheres, so it becomes bilingual or multipolar, so to speak?
Well, I'll jump in on the first part of it. And so, and to be clear, I don't believe that we are in a Cold War at this moment. I think right now it is largely multipolar. I think the US and China are the two, the biggest of the two right now, but I definitely think it's multipolar, and I think it will increasingly become multipolar. But I don't want to give the impression that I think all hope is lost. I think both sides are pretty clear-eyed about where the other party is, and whether it's going to be something we can bridge. Again, I'm hopeful but not optimistic, but I think it's going to become multipolar, and you'll see a sort of a splinter of what I guess I call techno-democracies, and then sort of techno-authoritarians. And I'm sure somebody can come up with better branding for that than I just did, but I think that's where it's going to go. I don't see it being a Cold War necessarily in the way that we saw with the Soviets in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think the economies, and we live in a more globalized world, and the economies are much too intertwined for it to be as sharp a break as it was back during the Cold War. So I think there's a little more nuance in there, and I perhaps didn't do as good a job explaining that. But I do think it is something that some of the splintering is inevitable, but I don't at this point see a complete rupture absent something catastrophic.
Yeah, maybe I would take a more commercial perspective to look at the question. I think between US and China market, if any company try to straddle both of them, I think it's the type of consumer-oriented firms who are stuck in between the crosshairs, and they're going to be there for a while. Because you look at companies like Tesla and Apple, it's really hard for them to pick a side. Versus if you are you are B2B type of business, then that's pretty easy to side with one or another. I think that's kind of a different type of business perspective on this. And outside of direct US-China market or technology conflict, I think there's also certain territory, I think that has less tension. I think everyone is going to be impacted by this technology competition between the two biggest economies in the world. But if you look at like pockets of the world who are a little bit distant from the heart of this battlefield, if you will, Southeast Asia could be one. And if you look at Africa, I think there are a lot of recent reports about undersea cable construction around that continent. There are two of them being led by Chinese firms being constructed right now. One of them is claimed to be the longest undersea cable in the world. It has landing posts in 33 countries, and it's supposed to be finished in like a year or two. And that coalition is led by China Mobile, and US companies, European companies, African telcos are part of that 9-country coalition to build this very, very long undersea digital infrastructure. And that means that this project got permission from regulatory authorities from 33 countries. It doesn't have a landing post in China or in US. That's why it's out of FCC's jurisdiction. And I think that's the pocket where you can still see US-Chinese company collaborate with each other, even with firms from other jurisdictions.
That's interesting. And, what I would add is just highlight, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the response, the US and global response with sanctions has changed the game a little bit, in my opinion. And China's choice to essentially side with Russia, at least, or I think is quietly rooting for Russia to be able to withstand this kind of economic pressure and isolation, because of if total Russian failure in Ukraine, I think is viewed as a net negative from a Chinese perspective in terms of its ability to influence things in Asia. So that raises the stakes in my mind on cross-border payments, on some of the digital infrastructure issues, on some of the high-tech trade. It's certainly possible. So there's lots of options. I think we could drive things into a very bifurcated approach if we want to, or if we're not careful. But we can also just, as Xiaomeng kind of alluded to, build higher walls against a small number of things and allow broader commercial and consumer activity still be more broadly shared internationally and more interoperable. We're trying to go that way with 5G and open radio access network, and having more vendor diversity and transparency and giving more choice to people who want to build networks. So there's some areas where we could keep things globalized or interconnected, but I think no doubt there's going to be segments that are going to be highly bifurcated and contested over, and you know, that's where this investment competition and the diplomatic arguments. I mean, the U.S. always likes to say we don't want to force countries to choose between China and the U.S., and yet we eventually do that with things like the Clean Network Initiative or the Future Alliance for the Future of the Internet, or in a democracy summit, or other types of things where we're kind of, sometimes we're pushing countries to essentially choose, and we've got to be careful to pick our battles, I think, on that front.
Thank you. One of the words that I'm hearing a lot from all of you is, you know, the private sector, commercial use companies, right? The role of the private sector as a non-state actor is tremendous, especially in all of this technology development and innovation. But at the same time, it seems like Washington has a very different perspective on the private sector from that of China, I'm thinking, and which also differs from Japan. I think in the case of Japan, there is a lot of concern about the security element of the sharing of information and the security clearance, and the reliability of Japanese companies to actually ensure that state secrets are kept. Do you think that there are ways for private companies, the private sector, to have a greater say? Can it be improved? Should it be improved as we develop these new frameworks for technology cooperation, or new frameworks for data management, or is the current system adequate?
Well, just quickly, I'll jump in. I mean, I think already we see the business sector lobbying in both countries, at least in the United States and Japan, behind the scenes, but rather aggressively on some of these proposed changes. So some of the economic security components in Japan of the legislation were held back in the first go round because they were considered either politically too sensitive, or because business really there was an outbound investment screening option that was going to be considered in the first round that they dropped. That component is also in the House bill, I think, on the Competes Act, and that's also very controversial among U.S. companies in terms of having investments in China be screened by the government about whether or not that's okay. Big concerns about how some of these supply chain obligations, increasing costs, reducing options. So there's a balance that has to be struck, and that's the way our systems work, which is good that we get that private sector input. So it can be managed, but it's these are new areas. We've gotten really good at managing, automobile supply chains, or other types of traditional. The energy market is now adjusting, but that's we're pretty solid on that front. But in a lot of these newer areas, supply chain resiliency in the software field is a whole new animal from an alliance perspective. So that's what I think we need to facilitate, getting those companies together with government.
Yeah, maybe if I can add my 2 cents here, I think in the past 20 years of globalization sort of produced a large number of big multinationals who are not only a formidable economic commercial force, and also grew quite a bit political clout themselves. And in a major time of changing geopolitical landscape, I think these companies are the one that afford to be getting the most intelligence and most insight and access and influence to all the policymakers around the world, whether for example, in the semiconductor industry, there is a very big trend for all the industry players to jump into this new bandwagon to build redundancy. They used to have a very robust, commercially prioritized supply chain, but now under the influence of geopolitical conflicts, they realize that they really need redundancy. That's a priority right now. And with that realization, I think they can leverage a lot of the changing government policy directions, whether in EU, in US, there's more and more government support coming to the industry if they can help with the government to reshore, friendshore their manufacturing capacities. Even in like Taiwan and South Korea and even India is proposing that type of government subsidies to private sector players. It's the big guys who can take advantage of them. I'm more concerned about how do we get input, how do we take into consideration the smaller companies who are less informed, who are more vulnerable to this type of policy shifts.
Did Shihoko freeze? Or Shihoko, were you speaking? You were muted.
I'm sorry, I'm muted. I've been doing this for long enough, and yet I'm on mute. I said, Cordell, do you want to add something? Or
no, I agree with Jim and Xiaomeng. I mean, during my time working in Congress, the private sector didn't have any trouble getting in and making its views known, and policymakers take that to heart. And so, and again, you look at no further than the example Xiaomeng gave of Congress is considering giving $52 billion to the semiconductor industry. So the private sector, at least in this side of the Pacific, is doing just fine getting into government.
Thanks. So let me turn to some of the questions we received, and perhaps I can kind of paraphrase them. One is from Chris Weston, and he's talking about the green economy agenda. And I know, Jim, you did mention that dealing with climate change is one of the issues that could bring the United States and Japan even closer together. Certainly for the Biden administration, there had been a lot of expectation that this would be the big issue that would actually allow the United States and China and beyond to work together. Is that still the case? Can we still have some optimism on a cross-border issue like climate to bring us together? And I know I'm supposed to be a moderator, so I can't really opine, but I'm thinking that we're dealing with a global pandemic, and yet that in itself has become a source of great contention. So I am not particularly optimistic about this, but I leave it to the three of you to discuss.
Well, I think there certainly are opportunities, but there's no doubt that we're in danger of overdoing it in terms of if we're going to, block out or kind of prohibit wide ranges of scientific cooperation and commercial collaboration with partners, including China, and certainly with India and with others in Europe, for fear of a kind of well, we don't want them in our scientific or engineering or innovation ecosystem writ large. That's a problem, because that's going to cut us off from collaborating on some of these true global commons issues, and the politics is going to interfere. I mean, everything is politicized as the pandemic was, and inhibited international collaboration on that front. That doesn't mean we can't come to terms with that and figure out ways to, I think, again, build higher walls against fewer things, and say it's okay in certain areas and less okay in other areas. And if people want to use science as a weapon, and we won't cooperate with you because we don't agree with you on all these other issues, that's just a political problem we have to fight through and overcome, in my opinion. It won't be easy, but I think we can do it.
I agree with that. It certainly won't be easy, but I think there's definitely possibility. Like I said, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I guess under Biden administration, I think some of this fine tuning of Trump's China policy is already happening, right? Like the DOJ's China initiative now has been reformed. They are strictly targeting cyber theft, IP theft, instead of in the past. A lot of the federal government agents are very much encouraged to pursue anyone they think is suspicious of any IP transfer, and that open up a large range of investigation that end up not producing much concrete outcome, exactly targeting on the problem the initiative designed to fix. I think that's already happening. Also, like the TikTok WeChat ban initiative that has been struck down by the court, and Biden administration later on took a little more measured approach to it. I think that's, generally speaking, is a positive trend.
I'd just add quickly that the high capacity battery piece and the connection to rare earth metals, and that is definitely in the crosshairs of kind of economic security. So at that level, that's going to be tough to separate from the green energy, renewable piece. But there was one question in the chat about over reliance on China for rare earth metals. There will be an effort to diversify supply on that front, and that may make it less sensitive and less political if we're successful at that.
So we have a question from Akira Jigo asking really about the TPP and the US alternative vision, the Indo-Pacific economic framework. I think one of the questions that we would have is what role do trade agreements play in harmonizing innovation and harmonizing some of the technology challenges that we have? Of course, neither the United States nor China are part of CPTPP. Does this make it easier or more difficult to have greater technology cooperation? Does this lead to greater the creation of those technology spheres, or will it mitigate this creation of a separation of technology compatibility?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. My sort of off the cuff assessment is that I think it'll make it easier for a narrow set of technology. I don't think it, again, not having US or China in CPTPP will get to any sort of broad-based understanding. So I think it perhaps makes it easier, but for a much narrower set of things.
I mean, generally speaking, I come to the issue of rules and rulemaking. The U.S. and Japan in particular talk a lot about wanting a rules-based international order. But in practice, the U.S. has some trouble with rules sometimes. There are a lot of international agreements we adhere to, but we don't ratify them, and we reserve the right to opt out of certain things here and there. So are we willing more generally to govern ourselves, and this includes with China and India and others, by agreed upon rules or not? I think in the current environment and where we're going and what's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere, I'm less optimistic that a formal rules-based agreements are going to work, and we have to go almost more by behavior and reinforcing good behavior rather than trying to get everybody to sign up to specific rules.
And maybe I'm thinking maybe I'm a little bit naive on this one. I kind of generally think the framework of CPTPP at least give the country who sign up for it kind of a model somewhere, kind of a third option if they are not perfectly aligned on China, if they are not yet perfectly aligned with the US, given the US doesn't have its own privacy law, its data localization position is kind of not fully confirmed. Given there may be a second Trump administration coming on board in a couple of years, I think there's a path for countries that's stuck in the middle in the Pacific Ocean to find another a way to align themselves to build a common market in terms of data governance models. I think in that sense, it makes good commercial sense. Of course, it's not as ideal as if US can sign on this agreement that will significantly bolster its influence and add to its weight. That's the agreement was originally designed for. Of course, if you are a total idealist, you would think maybe someday China will somewhat coming closer to this part of the world, given data flow is part of the country's digital economy, and it has a big say in the global digital system. And the country so far has put out a CPTPP application, but their intention has been questioned by any observers. It's hard to say at this point. They try to get a foot in the door or explore potential opportunities to plug into this economic sphere, or they're trying to use this as leverage to extend influence of their own model, a competing model with CPTPP. It's hard to say, but I think back to the roots of CPTPP, when Obama designed this economic framework, his idealist approach is to have both of them sign on, both US and China and everyone else in Asia Pacific. It will take us probably a long time, much longer than President Obama envisioned initially for that to happen. But I think it's good to have a North Star. It's good to still have hope in this day and age.
That's a really great way to conclude this conversation, with like a big, hope and optimism. I know we have had a number of people post questions, and I do apologize for not being able to get to them, but I'm afraid the time has come for us to make way for our second panel. But before I say goodbye, I hope you will join me in thanking Cordell, Jim, and Xiaomeng for this really great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for
Very
having
much.
us.
Yeah.
Thank you.